welcome to Religion Off the Beaten Track with Robin Douglas, a podcast on the lesser-known aspects of religion and belief.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Religion Off the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Robin Douglas, and today I'm joined by Chas Clifton, an author and retired academic who was at Colorado State University for many years. Thanks for being with us today, Chas.
Oh, thanks very much for inviting me.
Now, you're known as a writer and an academic in the discipline of Pagan Studies, which is a relatively new discipline. I believe that your background and early career were outside that field, so perhaps we could start with the question of how you came to take the path in Pagan Studies that you did.
Well, that's a very good question, and it was a complicated, twisty path. But in the 1980s, well, I spent the 80s basically in journalism, and I was working at one newspaper in Colorado Springs and did a number of articles on what we were just learning to call new religious movements. People were mostly saying cults back then because this was the cult scare of the 80s, when the Scientologists or the Hare Krishnas were coming to snatch your children. And that ignited some interest in that I wanted to go deeper than was possible to do in daily journalism. And then I began a transition out of journalism that took a while. I went to graduate school, went back to another newspaper job when I needed money, and then eventually was hired at Colorado State, the smaller of the two campuses, the one in Pueblo, where I actually worked in the Department of English and Foreign Languages, primarily teaching nonfiction writing, nature writing, creative nonfiction, rhetoric, that sort of thing. In graduate school, I had gone in thinking primarily in terms of new religious movements, but the study of new religious movements is still, after, 60 or 70 years, kind of an academic orphan. And within the academy, that is to say, within the American Academy of Religion and related bodies, it seems to never have achieved the standing it should have. And when you think that all religions began as new at some point, that the study of these processes would be of interest, but anyway, not necessarily. There really wasn't such a thing as pagan studies then, insofar as one couldn't really do graduate level research in a field in which none of the professors had any expertise. This was a wall that I ran into and that I know others ran into. A couple things happened though then in the late 80s. One, I had started a zine, my own little hand-produced magazine called Iron Mountain, a Journal of Magical Religion, which is now available online, digitized, thanks to an archive in Georgia at Valdosta State University. I can give you the URL. And there began to be some academic interest shown in the new pagan religions under the umbrella of new religious movements. And one of the key figures there was a man who's now in his, 80s, named Aidan Kelly, who was a graduate student at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, was also an initiated witch, and one of the key figures of the 1960s Bay Area pagan revival. The first thing he began to do was take the study of textual criticism that he had learned at the GTU and start applying it to the Gardnerian Book of Shadows, just as they do with Gospels and similar, to try to figure out which version was earlier. There are procedures for this, and how different scribal hands might have changed it and this sort of thing. And he published one book on that, on the beginnings of the Gardnerian movement. Not saying that everything was perfect about it, but it was the first time that anybody had tried an academic approach, asking academic questions to this new movement, as opposed to basically a journalistic approach. of which there were plenty, some better than others, you know. But really, it took a long time for pagan studies to get any sort of foothold within the American religious studies area. As I recall, a group of us started meeting within the AAR in the mid 90s, just sitting around and talking. Wouldn't it be nice if?
This is the AAR, as in the American Academy of Religion.
Right. Which is a fairly large body. I just came back from the annual meeting last month. It was 8,000 people. That's about typical. And of course, not everybody comes to the meeting. It's really an international body to some extent. And in about 1997, I think it was, we applied to the program committee to have our own unit, have our own meetings. And they turned us down with the argument that we hadn't really demonstrated that our interests were not being met elsewhere, that the new religious movements or women in religion or any of quite a number of other program units couldn't accommodate us. Well, as a matter of fact, the new religious movements were starting to get sick of us because we were taking up too much space in their sessions. But the upshot of it was that we, for a period of about 6 years or so, began what was called an additional meeting, where we basically paid a small fee. We were listed in the program. People gave papers. There was discussion. It functioned just as a program unit, but without the institutional blessing. And then we came back again in 2004 and said, see what we've been doing. Please, can't we be a program unit? And at that point, there was a bit of change going on within the academy. And they said, yes, okay, you can be for 3 years. And then the 3 years was extended, and now we're permanent. It was also during that time, I would say, I want to point out, around 97 or so, that Graham Harvey, who was one of the founding committee members, so to speak, stood up one day and said, you know, we really ought to drop the term neo-pagan after 50 years. Can't we call it something else? And that's when the academia, at least those of us in the AAR, started shifting toward contemporary pagan, which was the name of our program unit, contemporary pagan.
Okay. So it was the 21st century before you were given, as it were, space by the AAR.
Our first official session was in 2005.
Gosh, yes. In this country, I think the first academic conference on pagan studies was in 1994 or thereabouts, and the first books started appearing around the mid-90s.
Well, the books were already coming out. That was part of our argument. Yeah, that was part of what we used to demonstrate the fact that this is an actual field that's growing. Also, the Pomegranate, the journal that I edit, was already established in the late 90s by Fritz Muntin, who was another one of those 1960s Bay Area pagans, only he had moved to British Columbia, became professionally established there, and then as he began to wind down his career, he went to graduate school at the University of British Columbia studying these things, and decided to start a new, better quality zine called The Pomegranate. And then he brought me in to help him out editorially. And after 20 issues or so, I said, you know, we really ought to make this a peer-reviewed academic journal. And neither of us had exactly an idea what to do. But at the 2001 AAR meeting, he came and we trooped around from one publisher to another in the big book hall, showing him the current zine Pomegranate and saying, you know, we'd like to make this into a journal. And we got the best response from Janet Joyce, who at that time was, I think, editorial director of Continuum in one of the British academic houses. And she said she'd like to do it, but could we just wait a little longer because she had something in the works. And so we, having no better offer, we waited. And then about 2 or 3 years later, she launched Equinox, the publishing house that she now owns. And we were immediately one of the first journals for Equinox and have been there ever since. it all started coming together around 2004, 2005 in terms of having an institutional identity, at least within AAR, with having a journal, and with an increasing number of books being published.
I think it was around then that you and Graham Harvey published The Paganism Reader. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that was about 2004. I didn't like the way we were treated by the publisher, typical author's complaint. But basically, it was, as you say, it was a reader. It was an anthology of ancient and more recent texts that we felt had been influential on the current pagan movement, the kind of texts that people had gone to for inspiration, such as the Isis speech from the Golden Ass. We blew our whole budget on Kipling because whoever has the rights to Kipling wants a lot of money for reprints. Yeah, that was a decent book. I don't think it really got the attention it should have. Maybe we were not quite as savvy about publicity as we could have been.
Okay. Okay. And if we go back to the 80s, an Iron Mountain, which you've mentioned, that wasn't an academic journal. I think I'm right in saying.
It was a sort of zine with one foot in journalism and one foot in academia. I did have some friends from graduate school writing for it, but yeah, it was whatever struck my mind as magical religion. So we had American Indian stuff. We had Aidan Kelly writing about the Book of Shadows. We had stuff on modern shamanism, what have you. There were only 4 issues published.
And I think you had Doreen Valiente writing in to take issue with Aidan Kelly.
Yeah, we had a little letters column dispute. It's my great regret that I never got to meet her. I finally made it to Brighton about 3 months after she'd passed. I went to stay with Evan John Jones for a time. He and I had collaborated on one book before we'd ever actually met.
Ah, yes. Now, this is Sacred Masks, Sacred Dance, am I right? Which is about the use of masks in ritual and in the context of mystical experiences.
Right. Which is 80% him and 20% me. It's kind of a niche book. I think the most interesting thing I found about it was in doing some of my research and later, doing a little live action stuff, how quickly that comes back. The value of masking as a magical technique, I think it's really underrated, and it's often seen as sort of maybe self-consciously folkloric, that you've got to be doing it within some particular traditional context. But I think there was more that could have been done, but it opened some interesting doors.
Is that doors as in further directions for academic research?
Yeah, for the things that practitioners could do. As I said, I think masking is underappreciated. It was a practitioner book. The publisher was Llewellyn, who did only practitioner books. In fact, I had edited a 4-volume series for them in the early 90s, and they were at that time, very leery of anything that was too intellectually demanding. No footnotes.
Llewellyn have footnotes now, fortunately.
Yeah, they've changed. Llewellyn has changed. They tried to recruit me back then as an editor, and for a variety of reasons, I didn't want to do it, but they're not as timid as they used to be, and they've published some really excellent things that 1990s Llewellyn would have never looked at.
Okay. So there was Sacred Masks, Sacred Dance, which was more of a practitioner book than an academic book. Was The Paganism Reader your first academic book then?
Uh, yeah, it kind of was. I'd edited 4 others, but they were practitioner-oriented books. And then at the same time, I was working on Her Hidden Children, which is kind of out of date now, but was basically my attempt to deal with the whole question of nature religion. Nature religion had always been a sort of euphemism when you didn't want to use the W word. For example, again, going back to the American Academy of Religion, in those years when we had our little auxiliary unit going, we called it the Nature Religion Scholars Workshop. Not workshop, but anyway. Then we found out that there was a schism there because there were some people who wanted to deal with nature in a totally non-theistic way, what's sometimes called deep green nature. It's the kind of Braun Taylor, who's probably the guy most associated with that in this country, but it ties more into deep ecology at one end. And on the other end, you had the polytheistic pagans who were using nature religion in a very different sense of the word, a sense in which, among other things, deity is not seen as being outside of creation. And so what I was attempting to do with Her Hidden Children, along with giving a very broad brush version of the pagan revival in North America, was to answer some of these questions. What do we mean by nature? And so I came up with a little three-part scheme where I could talk about cosmic nature, which might be exemplified by astrology, for example, finding meaning in the movements of the cosmos, Gaian nature, which is, the earth, and the body is nature. Because one of the points that I wanted to remind people was that the body and the mind are mostly outside the control of the ego. Therefore, they're part of nature. Your ego controls very little. The ego is somebody sitting in a house at the edge of the jungle with the curtains drawn. Most of what goes on in your mind and most of your bodily processes are outside the ego, so therefore they are nature. I mean, that's my definition of nature, which is not original to me. I borrowed a big chunk of it from the American poet, philosopher Gary Snyder. But basically, nature is all the processes that are outside the human ego. So it's not a question of whether a city is nature or not. Yes, a city is material and it was created by the activity of multiple human egos, but there's a lot that goes on there that's not under the control of humans. So that gives you what some people might call the paranormal. It gives you, as I said, much of what goes on with our bodies. It gives you the unconscious, the individual unconscious, the world unconscious. All of that can be called capital N nature. So if nature religion means establishing some sort of relationship with all that, it's a pretty big topic, actually. But as I was saying, within the unit, we found that there were people who wanted to only deal with it in a non-personal, non-theistic sort of way, the deep ecology way. And then there were those who were interested in all the multiple manifestations that we call pagan religions.
Okay, so you were essentially bringing that conceptual framework regarding nature religion to Her Hidden Children.
That was my hope, to try to open up some of those questions. I didn't want to just do a list of, this group started and then that group split off and this person became famous and da-da-da. It wasn't really about the personalities, but I had to do some of that. The other point about Her Hidden Children was that I was borrowing from the work of a scholar named Catherine Albanese, who was at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And she had written on nature religion in a way that was somewhat different. She was totally unaware of contemporary paganism at all when she was writing the book. But her interesting point was that in the United States, at least, that nature had developed as a source of spiritual authority, starting with the Romantic movement and what was called in New England the Transcendentalists and other things, so that by the late 1700s, early 1800s, you had people turning to nature, however conceived, as an alternative source of spiritual authority to any holy book that you would care to mention. And this, I think, has been an underappreciated current in American religion, because people studying American religion tend to look at the denominational bodies of one sort or another. But we also have this strong tradition of countering that with the natural world. I mean, it comes out in this sort of Jeffersonian way around 1800, where people start saying, well, Europe has castles and cathedrals. Those are just symbols of ancient oppression. We have magnificent mountains. We have deep canyons, this sort of thing. And those are a source of sublime inspiration. America is looking and Americans finding value in something that they could make a stronger claim to. And I think that that intellectual slash spiritual current is still very much with us. It had to do with the development of the national parks movement, which got really rolling in the 1870s. The idea that things should be preserved just because of the wow factor. It wasn't just preserving for the king's hunting grounds or anything like that. And of course, it's been contentious because, this is always in competition with other things that people want to do in the natural world. And it was a Eurocentric outlook, but nevertheless, it's been really, really important. It is really, really important to the point where I think that for most Americans, it's invisible.
And it's interesting that someone like Catherine Albanese could study this, presumably for many years, without connecting it with contemporary paganism.
Well, no, I don't fault her for that. She was basically a 19th century historian of religion, or a historian of 19th century religion, I should say. And the modern pagan movement just wasn't on her radar. She was more concerned with what was being done in the 1840s or whenever. One of the things that she did, for example, was connect this sort of nature religion with health movements and dietary movements, which was a very lively issue in the mid-19th century. The idea that you should treat your body only with natural cures. This she sees as one component. But no, I don't really blame her. Contemporary paganism just was not very noticed. It took a long time.
Okay, so by the early years of the 21st century, pagan studies was starting to make some headway in the academic world. One question that arises is whether the momentum has continued, because there's one very well-known scholar of pagan studies over here in Britain who's observed that pagan studies seems to be shrinking, which is a rather alarming prospect. Could it be the case that the field is already past its peak?
Well, I understand why a person might say that. I mean, there's always a sort of initial explosion of newness. This is the new shiny thing. Let's all write a book about it. The initial intellectual exploration is what I call scouting, in the sense of, who are these people? Where'd they come from? Are they friendly? What do they have to offer us? And those books were being written in the 90s and 2000s. And what I've seen as editor of the Pomegranate is that now the same thing is happening, especially in Eastern Europe. Conferences are getting flooded with papers about the growth of these movements and the implications of these movements, especially when they get tied in with political ideas, which isn't so much an issue in the Anglosphere, but is important when you're talking about Ukraine or Poland or what have you. So I see Central to Eastern Europe as being the place where the new shiny stuff is right now. What I think that Anglosphere pagan studies needs to start doing is asking more complicated questions. There are a lot of things to be discussed. And maybe there's been a little bit of a hiatus or a little bit of loss of momentum. I wouldn't argue against that. But that's because I think that the scholars involved need to start thinking now, what are some deeper things we can talk about besides just, how many of them are there and what do they think?
And what sort of questions would you like to see asked?
Okay, one I just proposed, when we were kicking around our session for next year. Right now, the whole idea of reenchantment is very big. There are books and lots of people running around talking about reenchantment, often from a Christian point of view, but also others. But I think as something Ronald Hutton was touched upon in that big book he did on service magic and witches and persecution and so on.
This is The Witch, I think.
The witch, right. The idea that to be re-enchanted sounds really good, but actually enchanted worldviews can lead to all kinds of bad things too. They can lead to persecution and witch burnings and so on. And I see that happening. So I would love to see people sort of discuss, well, what's going on with this concept of re-enchantment? Another thing I see happening, again, I'm speaking mainly of the American scene here, is that contemporary pagans have been around long enough now in the public view that they're starting to be noticed and they're starting to be seen as a threat. it's very rhetorically confused because you have two definitions of paganism here, and I'm not sure that the people who are employing them really want them sorted out. But there is paganism as spiritual practice, and there is paganism in this bad sense, meaning, the horrible state that society will revert to if we take away monotheistic religion. Children will be abandoned at the city gates, and might will make right, and you might as well have slavery, and so on and so on and so on. In other words, it's going back to the idea that it was Christianity humanized ancient Roman society, for example. As I say, I think a lot of the people who are pushing this view really don't want to make too much of a distinction. Some of what I'm reading is like being back in the mid fourth century, Robin. It's, your gods are all demons, this kind of thing. It hasn't really changed. Something else that I think needs to be attended to are the implications of polytheism. There's only a few people really working on this. Maybe they're not really comfortable with it, but the ways of talking about religion in the academy are still mostly predicated on scripture-based monotheistic religions, despite any attention given to Asian religions or anything like that, or indigenous religion or anything like that. And I think it's the question, where we sort of, to use another buzzword, we kind of need to decolonize religious studies in that sense, get the monotheistic lens off. It's the lens that most people are not even used to discussing. And then we could talk more about different ways of being religious. There are a lot of deeper questions, I think. And I think that's where we are, that people have to just get beyond the simple questions of trying to quantify the movement, how many people in Britain identify as Druids or whatever, and start really talking about how is this affecting and interacting with society. Like I say, in the Anglosphere, the political aspect has not been so big. In some other countries, there's a real concern about whether pagan organizations may also have political baggage, which plays into the viewpoints of the person who wants to say that, paganism is nothing but savagery. That if we take away the civilizing influence of Christianity in particular, then, this will all turn into just people slaughtering each other.
Okay. Well, this is interesting stuff and possibly also disturbing stuff. I'm not someone who is young any longer, but perhaps I can ask, if I was in my early 20s and I was just going into the field, is there any advice that you would want to give in the sense of career advice or research suggestions?
I would say, well, religious studies is a difficult field to find employment in. And a lot of attention is being paid to these days to basically answering the question of what else can you do with a religious studies degree besides teach? Certainly, there are no jobs in pagan studies or new religious movements even. I mean, if you want to be a university professor, then you need to have a lot of arrows in your quiver besides that one. You need to be able to teach in some other aspect of the discipline as well. Graham Harvey started out primarily with Judaism, actually, and then moved into more this study of animism and indigenous religion. That was later on. Another guy I knew who was very good, basically was a scholar of Chinese religion, and that's how he got hired. I've known other people who were basically, the big arrow in their quiver was something like, women in religion or sociology or something like that.
Ronald Hutton was primarily a historian of the Civil War, and I think he still is to some extent.
Right. And as you know, he said that writing Triumph of the Moon actually hurt him on the other side of his profession, because here he'd been churning out stuff about, well, he did his one book on pagan Britain, but he'd been mostly doing stuff about the Stuarts and the Civil War and so forth. And all of a sudden, here's this weird thing. Can we take this man seriously or not? That's something a lot of people would face. But in a perverse way, that might be okay because, it keeps you from being in your own little rut too much. And like I say, maybe it gives you impetus to ask tougher questions than just staying in some safe pagan studies ghetto, which is the last thing we need. I would really rather see pagan studies have very fuzzy boundaries where you can go into a lot of other things.
Although it would be nice, wouldn't it, if there were more chairs of pagan studies around, or pagan studies programs, or pagan studies journals. Not that the pomegranate isn't excellent, of course.
Some on paganism appears in other journals. We are the only one totally focused on it, but you can find it in Nova Religio or Magic Religion and Witchcraft or some others. But yeah, I don't think there's going to be any chairs for a long, long time. And you just have to accept that you're going to be kind of at the margins. But as I said, maybe that's a good thing. Going back to AAR, I remember one time I was riding on one of the buses. This was in Chicago that took us from the hotel to the convention center, and I'm sitting in the row behind two young New Testament scholars. Now those guys can find work if anybody can, but this one was talking about, I think, his dissertation or something had been, devoted to basically 3 verses of the Gospel of Mark. And he had discovered some new slant on this after 2,000 years of exegesis of the Gospel of Mark. And he was very proud of himself and saying, that's not what I want us to look like. I want us to be going all kinds of directions. Popular culture has been really fruitful for some people. Interaction of themes in music and film and what have you. There's a lot to be done. And the other thing I think that we have to show is that a scholarly inquiry into paganism can illuminate stuff besides paganism. You can have applicability outside. The big trouble with pagan studies is trying to keep it from turning into this sort of self-referential ghetto sort of thing. The people who are running the unit right now in the American Academy of Religion have done a really good job with that. Christopher Chase at Iowa State and Giovanna Parmigiani at Harvard Divinity School, reaching out to people in other fields and doing collaborations and one sort of thing. I think that's our strength. We bring a kind of new spiciness to these discussions that wasn't there before.
A new spiciness. Indeed. Indeed. And I think that's a suitable point to end. There's a lot to consider there about the future of the discipline. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us, Chas Clifton, and very best wishes with your future endeavours and indeed with your retirement.
You get me wound up and you never know what I'll say. Thanks a lot.